My name is Tom Carter, and today I would like to talk to you about the book Discipleship by Dietrich BonHoeffer. Dietrich BonHoeffer was alive in a time of the world when it was in great peril, during the time of World War II. He was in Germany during World War II as a pastor, part of a group of pastors that did not fall into the Nazi propaganda machine that was out there trying to unite the Protestant churches to being ran by the government and being used to propagate the Nazism and the anti-Semitism and different things that were going on within the Nazi regime. Dietrich BonHoeffer was a devout Christian. He studied theology in the United States, went back to Germany, and became a pastor of a church. When I look at Dietrich BonHoeffer and I look at his book, Discipleship, I want to say that he leaves it all on the line. He tells it like it is. And I think that sometimes, as I was reading the book, I was thinking that maybe the fact that the world that he lived in really had a great effect on how he wrote. He wrote the book about being disciples and the call that it is to be a disciple. Not that that we choose to be disciples, but that discipleship is a calling from God, the same as we would say ministry is a calling from God, or to be a missionary is a calling from God. To be a disciple is definitely a calling from God. And as I look at the world that he was in, and I look at how he wrote, it makes me wonder if he's just really just going to let us have it. I think sometimes maybe Christianity today, where we, especially here in America, where sometimes we think we might have it a little bit easier, and we don't. Sometimes we soften things up because we don't want to stir up the crowd, or we don't want to make an enemy, out of things. We would say that Dietrich BonHoeffer, more than anybody else, probably could have been that way. But yet he chose to live his life in such a way to honor God in all that he did. And he laid it all out upon the lines. He doesn't mince words. When he talks about grace, he talks about cheap grace. And how I would liken cheap grace, if I were to put it in today's language, would be, our easy beliefism. All you have to do is say a prayer and you're saved. You can go to church, you can do, just go to church, some when you can, when you don't have to work, and there's not a ball game on Sunday, you just kind of got to just believe that there's a God out there, and that we're all just good enough, and that we're all just going to make it to heaven. But when we look at costly grace, as he spends time developing that, he talks about how deep into the gospel and the passion for the gospel and the deep drive of the gospel and the life-changing effects that the gospel should have on us, and the sacrifices that we're willing to make for the gospel. Dietrich could have sided with the Nazi regime. He could have sided with contemporary theologians within his own country to possibly even preserve his own life, but yet would it cost him something even more? Costly grace, is a deep-rooted thing, within it. He talks about if grace is the result given by Christ himself to the Christian life, then life is not for one moment excused from discipleship. But if grace is a principal presupposition of my Christian life, then in advance I have justification for whatever sin I committed in my life and in this world. I cannot sin on the basis of this grace. The world is in principle justified by grace, and I thus remain as before in my, I should have picked a better one here, bureaucratic secular existence. Everything remains as before. He's talking about this grace that we've got to just live our lives for God. We've got to escape. We've got to focus on what God has called us to do. To be a disciple is costly grace, even though some today would make it cheap grace. Some would say we can sin boldly. We could just go out and just commit sin and do what we want. But then what is grace? What is so amazing about grace? As he moves through the book here, and as I got it here in front of me, I can kind of thumb through it a little bit. He spends a lot of time developing what it means to be a disciple, and one part about the book that I loved was how he relates being a disciple to the Sermon on the Mount. We think of the Sermon on the Mount. It's some groups say that it's not for our time. That it's all about living in the kingdom that is to come, or they have other excuses why they don't want to follow it. They even say it's impossible to follow the Sermon on the Mount, and there are those that want to discredit it as being for the church. But I really appreciated BonHoeffer's take upon the Sermon on the Mount, because I do believe that it is for us as Christians, and that we do need to follow the tenets of the Sermon on the Mount. But I've never really thought about it in the life of a disciple, somebody who's walking and spreading the gospel, whether it be in the Beatitudes, and where Jesus is talking about, blessed, and Jesus is speaking to his disciples when he said blessed, as BonHoeffer put it, and he says that he speaks to those who are under the power of his call. The calling has made them poor, tempted and hungry. He calls them blessed not because of their want of reunification. Neither want nor reunification are themselves any reason to be called blessed. The only adequate reason is the call and promise for those for whose sake those who follow him live in want and reunification. You just start looking down through here, blessed is the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The disciples are needy in every way. They are simply poor. They have no security, no property to call their own, no price of earth they could call their home, no earthly community to which they might fully belong. But they also have neither spiritual power of their own, nor experience or knowledge that can refer to and which could comfort them. For his sake, they have lost all that. And when they follow him, they lost themselves and everything else which could have made them rich. Now they are poor, so inexperienced, so foolish that they cannot hope for anything except for him who called them. When we look at all of the Sermon on the Mount, and you relate it to being a disciple, again, you are the salt. You should be the salt. The disciples are given no choice of whether they want to be salt. I was just so moved by what BonHoeffer said and how he related the Sermon on the Mount to being a disciple of Christ. And as we go into the final sections of the book, where he talks about just various different issues in Christianity, and whether it be things on baptism and communion and sainthood and saints and different things of that nature, I think for me the most important section in the whole book on being a disciple had to be what he said upon the Sermon on the Mount. And I realize that this book is a collection of some of his sermons and some of his works. It used to be called The Cost of Discipleship. I know that the version that we have is called Discipleship. I think that it is definitely a book that needs to be in most pastors' libraries. I think it's one of those books that he does a very good job at going into the in-depthness that we need within what it means to be a disciple. And no 10-minute little video can really adequately, truly describe the importance of this book. But I would say that for a conservative Christian, and there are going to be a few spots in there maybe where you're going to disagree, where like when he talks about the church and salvation and deciding to take someone's salvation from them and stuff. There may be some things that we disagree with, partly because of the Lutheranism and that area of Bonhoeffer's life, but overall, and his commitment to the Scriptures, his commitment to teaching it as it is, and just laying it on the line, to live like you are dying. Bonhoeffer gave his life, I believe at age 38, he was hung by the Nazis for his crimes against the government, and whether they were proven or not, I think that Bonhoeffer knew by not joining up with them, at some point he was going to give his life up. And he needed to just lay out those teachings in the most effective and in the most blunt way. He didn't have time to sugarcoat things to help us kind of understand it. He just had to let it out. And I think that sometimes we in our ministries today can learn from Bonhoeffer too on that way. And we just need to become bold, and we need to, if God has called us to be a disciple, if He's called us to be a pastor, a teacher, a missionary, a youth pastor, whatever God has called us to be, we need to be bold about it, and embolden, and realize that we have to sacrifice things along the way in order to truly be a disciple of Christ. Again, thank you for your time. I encourage you to read this book. I'm Tom Carter, and hope you have a blessed day.